I have told this account 3 times now. Once to my survey director, once to the Registry Appeals Board, and once to my mate, who found it considerably funnier than I did. I will tell it a 4th time here, in the interest of completeness, and because the Interspecies Research Registry requires a formal statement from all named subjects when a behavioral catalogue of their species is entered into the permanent record. I am Exarch Veth Saroon, Survey Lead, Keth Saral Biological Expedition 7 Hadrith, operating under the Joint Science Charter of the Keth Saral Compact and the broader Conclave Transit Authority. I hold credentials in Environmental Systems Analysis, Multispectral Ecological Survey, and 3 subspecializations in Comparative Planetary Biota that I will not list here because they are relevant to what happened. What is relevant is that I have led 14 survey expeditions, published 61 peer-reviewed observations in the Compact Scientific Registry, and hold a formal commendation from the Conclave Biological Survey Division for excellence in field methodology. I have spent the better part of 3 decades being paid to observe things carefully and draw accurate conclusions from what I observe. I am considered, within my institution and within the Keth Saral scientific community more broadly, to be someone who notices things. I say all of this so that the context is clear. It is relevant context. It bears directly on what happened. I want there to be no ambiguity, in the formal record, about the professional standing of the expedition lead, who did not notice what was happening for 47 consecutive days. The record should reflect that he was not inexperienced. He was not careless in any general sense. He simply looked at something, decided what it was, and stopped looking. This is a failure that does not require inexperience. It is available to anyone, Dr. Maren Salas was 38 years old when she boarded the Sornvath at Transit Hub, Ketharanu. She held a post at something called the Meridian Institute for Field Biology on a planet I had never visited, and her official documentation described her subspecialty as behavioral ecology and species ethology, with a focus on long-duration field observation of communicative and social systems. She had been assigned to our expedition by the Transit Compact's Observer Placement Office, which requires that any conclave-registered scientific vessel operating in a system adjacent to human transit lanes carry at least 1 human science observer when the expedition duration exceeds 40 days. Our expedition was scheduled for 53 days. I had applied for an exemption on the grounds that our survey focus, the biota of Hadreth 7 Null, an uninhabited system with no human adjacent settlements, no contested resource zones, and no species of interest to human researchers, made the observer requirement functionally redundant. The exemption was denied. The Observer Placement Office sent me a form letter. I received along with the form letter a standard observer dossier, 3 pages. I read it. The dossier described Dr. Salas's institutional affiliation, her transit clearances, her field safety certifications, her equipment requirements, and her research focus. The research focus was described on the 3rd page as behavioral ecology and species ethology, with a focus on long-duration field observation of communicative and social systems in both non-sapient species and conclave member species in natural and constructed social contexts. I read those words. I then returned to my survey planning, because Hadrith 7 Null had 4 planets with sufficient atmospheric complexity to warrant biological survey, and I had a great deal of preparation to complete. I will return to the dossier. Dr. Salas arrived on the day of departure. She came aboard the Sornvath at the scheduled time, signed the vessel intake form without requiring explanation, and was shown to her quarters by my junior field technician, Vayan Carr, who reported back that she had unpacked her kit bag, sat down at the small desk in her cabin, opened one of the paper notebooks she had brought, and begun writing in it within approximately 4 minutes of the cabin door closing. Vankar mentioned this because he found it slightly unusual. We had carried observers before, and most of them spent their first hours aboard in the way that newcomers to any vessel spend their first hours, orienting, exploring, asking questions about protocols and layout and meal schedules. Dr. Salas had apparently arrived already oriented, or at least already at work. I noted this as a data point and thought nothing particular of it. Researchers write. The writing seemed normal. She carried a single kit bag, a sealed hard case of the kind I associated with fragile instruments, and a flat case that I assumed contained either a portable data surface or additional equipment. I learned, several days later, that the flat case contained nothing more than a quantity of bound paper notebooks and a collection of drawing implements. I remember thinking, when I learned this, that it seemed a great deal of physical weight for what amounted to stationery. I did not think this thought for long, because I had other things to consider. Soreth Vaughan, who had met her briefly at the docking connection, while I was occupied with the final departure checks, described her to me later that evening as quiet and unremarkable. This was accurate and inaccurate simultaneously, in the specific way that descriptions become inaccurate when the observer has looked at something without having understood what they were looking at. She was quiet. She was, in the conventional sense of the word, unremarkable. She made no demands, expressed no strong opinions. In the brief social exchanges of the boarding process, required nothing beyond standard accommodation. Soreth Vaughan had processed her, categorized her, and moved on. I had done the same when I read her dossier. We were, the two of us, experienced scientists who had both performed the same basic observational error, deciding what something was before we had collected sufficient data to know. The Sornvath departed on schedule. Dr. Salas was in the observation bay when we cleared the transit corridor, sitting in one of the secondary observation chairs, with her notebook open on her knee. I was managing the departure sequence from the bridge, and noticed her there through the connecting viewport. She was not looking at the transit display, which was showing the corridor calculations and the initial trajectory plot. She was looking at Vane Carr, who was running the departure checklist at the forward panel. She appeared to be drawing. Van Carr came to my station approximately 20 minutes after we cleared the corridor. She was drawing me, he said. She is a naturalist, I said. Naturalists draw things. He considered this. I am not a thing. You are a living organism engaged in skilled behavior in a professional environment, I said. From the perspective of a naturalist, that is observable. This did not appear to entirely reassure him. He returned to his panel. I returned to the trajectory data. The conversation seemed finished. The transit to Hadreth 7 Null would take 11 days. Over the course of those 11 days, Dr. Salas established what I came, by the end of the first week, to think of as her pattern. She woke before the ship's cycle recommended, and moved through the Sornvath in the early, quiet hours, often with a notebook, occasionally with one of the drawing implements, from her flat case. She appeared in the common areas and the observation bay and on 2 occasions, in the corridor outside the secondary analysis room. When the door was open and the team inside was running data, she did not interrupt ongoing work. She did not place herself in the center of rooms. She found edges and corners and secondary positions, the kind of spots that are technically in a room, without being in the way of anyone using the room for its primary purpose, and she sat in those spots and wrote in her notebook or drew in it, or occasionally did neither, and simply sat. She ate her meals in the common area at the far end of the table. She was quiet during meals. My crew is not quiet during meals. We are a species that treats shared eating time as a significant social integration context, with a specific set of interaction patterns that serve, among other things, to maintain and calibrate the social dynamics of a working group. I will not detail those patterns here, because Dr. Salas detailed them considerably more thoroughly than I would have, in pages 23 through 30 of her report. Under a section titled, Communal Food Intake Periods as Primary Social Integration Ritual. behavioral functions, and observed protocols. I will say only that mealtimes on a Saral expedition vessel are engaged and communicative, and involve a great deal of overlapping conversation, and that Dr. Salas sat at the end of the table through all of this, and watched the room with an expression I found, at the time, faintly difficult to read. I categorized it, imprecisely, as the expression of someone who is content. I was wrong about what specifically it was the expression of, but I was not wrong that it indicated contentment. She was in good access conditions. She was, I believe, pleased about that. My lead field analyst, Sorith Vaughn, was the one who gave Dr. Salas the nickname. This happened on the 6th day of the transit, during the evening data review session, when several of my crew were gathered in the analysis room, and Dr. Salas was in her usual position at the end of the room, not in the way of anything, writing steadily in her notebook. "The still one," Sorith Vaughn said, in the mild, companionable tone that signals a casual observation, rather than a significant judgment. She meant it as a descriptor. She was describing what she saw. An organism that was consistently, reliably present, without moving much and without causing difficulty. In Saral social vocabulary, a nickname of this kind is neither compliment nor criticism. It is a categorization, a way of making the unfamiliar familiar, of filing an entity into a mental slot, where it can be recalled and referenced, without ongoing, active attention. We name what we have understood. We named Dr. Salas the Still One, because we believed we understood her. The rest of the crew adopted the nickname within 2 days. It was accurate, in the way that a partial description of a thing is accurate. She was still. She was also many other things that we had not named, because we had not looked closely enough to see them. Dr. Salas, when she overheard the nickname, and she did overhear it, I am entirely certain of this now, said nothing, and wrote something in her notebook. I noticed at the time that she wrote something. I did not wonder what. We arrived at Hadrith 7 Null on the 12th day. The system was everything the preliminary survey data had suggested. 4 planets, with sufficient atmospheric complexity to warrant investigation. The third of them showing particularly strong biological indicators. Complex chemical signatures in the atmosphere, surface temperature ranges consistent with liquid water at multiple latitudes, spectral anomalies in the vegetation frequency bands that suggested significant biomass diversity. My team was, as teams tend to be at the start of a long-anticipated field survey, energized. There was the particular quality of focus that descends on a group of researchers when they have arrived at the place they have been traveling toward, and the real work is about to begin. We launched surface operations the following morning. Our primary field site on the third planet was in the northern temperate zone, where the biomass density indicators were highest and the terrain was accessible enough to support field equipment transit. The lander carried the full survey team, the standard field kit, the mobile atmospheric sampling array, the behavioral sensor array that represented a significant investment of both the expedition budget and my professional reputation, and Dr. Salas, with her kit bag, and her flat drawing case and her sealed hard case. I had allocated her a position at the edge of the survey perimeter, approximately 30 meters from our primary sample collection zone. This location gave her observation access to the site, without placing her in the movement corridors that the field team would be using throughout the day. I showed her the position, explained the safety protocols, and made sure she had her communications badge properly fitted. She thanked me. I returned to the survey setup. 40 minutes later, when I had finished calibrating the atmospheric sampling array and turned to do a visual check of the perimeter, I found that she had not gone to the position I had allocated her. She had moved approximately 15 meters to the left and slightly downslope from where I had placed her to a flat rock at the edge of a shallow depression in the terrain. She was sitting on the rock. Her notebook was open. She appeared to be drawing the vegetation canopy in the depression below her. I noted this. I did not correct it. because she was within the safety perimeter, and not in anyone's way. The position she had chosen was, I would have said if someone asked me at the time, essentially equivalent to the position I had allocated her. She had simply chosen her own spot rather than using mine. I understand now why she had chosen that specific spot. The flat rock at the edge of the depression gave her an unobstructed sightline to both the survey team's primary work area and to the access trail used by team members moving between the lander and the collection zone. It was the optimal position in the available terrain for observing the Earth's maximum number of crew activities with minimum repositioning. She had assessed the site and selected it within 40 minutes of arrival. At the time, I thought she had found a comfortable rock. The survey work was absorbing, and I gave Dr. Solace little active attention for the remainder of the morning. My team was running atmospheric samples and establishing the grid markers for the biotic survey zones, and this required the kind of focused coordinates that does not leave significant attentional capacity for monitoring the perimeter observer. I was aware, in the background of my attention, that she was there. I was not tracking what she was doing in any detail. At midday, I made the required check on her status. Observer Placement Office Protocol, Expedition Lead responsible for observer welfare at all field sites. I walked to the depression rock and found her in the same position she had occupied since morning, notebook open, drawing implement in hand. The sketch on the open page showed the vegetation canopy in considerably more detail than I would have expected from 5 hours of casual observation. There were measurement notations in the margins, and small arrows indicating structural details, and a set of annotations in a script I could not read. A second page was covered with what appeared to be a detailed study of a single plant species, leaf venation, stem structure, growth habit, several close-up details of the reproductive structures. Is that useful? I asked, looking at the botanical sketches. I was genuinely curious. We had spectral imaging data of the entire site. Yes, she said. We have full spectral imagery of the canopy zone, I said. I can have my imaging technician send you the dataset. Thank you, she said. I'd like that. She went back to drawing. I returned to the team. I did not ask what, specifically, the drawings added to the spectral data, or what information she was extracting from the direct observation that the imaging couldn't provide. She was a naturalist. She was drawing things. This seemed self-explanatory. It was not self-explanatory, or rather it was, but I had explained it to myself incorrectly. The behavioral sensor array. The piece of equipment I mentioned, the significant investment, was designed to passively record the movement patterns and interaction behaviors of the megafauna in our surveyed zone without the disturbance that a visible observer would cause. The theory was sound. The practice was that the local fauna, which had apparently evolved in an environment where anything large and stationary that emitted a very faint electromagnetic signal was something to avoid, had identified the array as foreign within approximately 2 hours of deployment and were giving it a radius of 40 meters of studied avoidance. We were getting excellent data on everything that happened more than 40 meters from the array, which was not where most of the interesting megafauna behavior was occurring. I became aware of this problem at the end of the first day when I reviewed the array footage and found that the behavioral data on the species I most wanted to study was almost entirely absent. I was calculating how long it would take for the local fauna to habituate to the array when Vainkar came to find me. The large herd animals, he said. The ones on the north ridge that we couldn't get the array close to. What about them? They've been feeding in the depression below the still ones rock for the last 3 hours, he said. They came within about 6 meters of her. She didn't move. I looked at him for a moment. She's drawing them, he said. She's been drawing them since they came in. Very detailed. I could see the page from about 20 meters back. I thought about this. They habituated to her, I said. They stopped responding to her presence completely around the second hour. Vankar said. The juveniles were investigating the rock she was sitting on. She didn't move, and they eventually lost interest and went back to feeding. I looked at the array position report on my data tablet. Then I looked at the depression on the terrain map. Then I thought about a field researcher who had spent, based on her publication record and the documentation in her dossier, something in the region of 15 years doing exactly this. Sitting in places where animals were not moving and recording what she saw. That is effective, I said. It's more effective than the array, Vankar said, with the expression of someone offering information they suspect the recipient will find unwelcome. It was more effective than the array. I adjusted the array position the following day to take advantage of the behavioral data Dr. Salas was collecting by other means. The local megafauna continued to ignore her and continued to give the array a 40-meter margin, but since I was now positioning the array to capture the areas adjacent to where she was sitting, the footage began to improve. I credited this in my field log as integration of direct observational data with remote sensing array, enabling improved capture of natural behavioral sequences. This was accurate. What I did not write in the field log was that the direct observational data was being generated by a human sitting on a rock, not moving, and that this method was producing better behavioral documentation than my array, because the animals had correctly identified which of those two things was dangerous and which was not, and had acted accordingly. Dr. Salas, during this period, asked me no questions about the array. She asked me one question about the megafauna, which was whether I had observed the species in the depression before, or whether this survey represented first contact with them. I said first contact, that the species was unregistered. She thanked me, wrote something in her notebook and returned to drawing. The pattern of the expedition settled. My team conducted the biological survey in the systematic, methodical way I had planned. Spectral analysis, atmospheric sampling, biotic collection, behavioral monitoring through a combination of array data, and the steadily improving footage I was getting from the areas adjacent to Dr. Salas's daily observation positions. She moved her position each day, I eventually noticed, not randomly but in a deliberate rotation, around the available survey sites, as though she were running a sampling protocol of her own. I noticed this on approximately day 18 and thought, with the comfortable confidence of someone who has categorized a thing and moved on, that she was rotating her observation positions to capture the widest range of plant species. For her botanical sketches, she was rotating her observation positions. She was not primarily sketching plants. Sorith Van came to me on the evening of day 21 with a question she had not had time to ask during the surface work. We were in the analysis room, the full team, assembled for the nightly data consolidation. Dr. Salas at her end of the table with her notebook open, writing steadily. The notebook had been nearly new when we arrived at Hadrath 7 Null. It was now approximately 2/3 full. I asked her today what she's studying. Sorith Van said, in the conversational tone she uses when sharing incidental information between data inputs. The local biota, I said. I was reviewing the atmospheric particulate analysis from the previous day's samples, and was giving her perhaps 60% of my attention. This was in retrospect the wrong proportion. She said, among other things, Sorith Van said, I gave her another few percent of my attention. She's a naturalist. They tend to study multiple species in parallel. It is more efficient use of observation time. She said it in a way that seemed like she meant several specific other things. Sorith Van said, rather than other things in the general sense. I considered this briefly. Did you ask what the other things were? She had started drawing again by then, Sorith Van said. I made a note to follow up. I did not follow up. The data consolidation proceeded, and the note slipped behind everything else in my attention. And I did not remember it until I read the report 5 weeks later and found that it was, in fact, the key question that would have changed everything had I thought to press it. Among other things, Day 28, a weather hold had grounded our surface operations. Hadreth 7 Null's third planet was geologically active and its atmospheric behavior in the target latitudes was more variable than the preliminary data had suggested. 2 days out of every 8, we were aboard the Sornvath, while the surface conditions stabilized. On this particular day we had received a forecast, indicating a 6-hour hold, which was long enough to be frustrating and short enough that beginning secondary survey work would have been inefficient. My team occupied themselves in the various ways that field researchers occupy themselves during unexpected gaps in fieldwork. There was ongoing instrument maintenance. There was data review. There was the card game. The card game deserves brief description. It is a Keth Saral game called, in translation, something like Positions, and it involves a small set of tokens with values that are both fixed and context-dependent, and a betting structure that requires players to communicate via signals that are semi-formalized and semi-improvised, something about the tokens they hold without directly stating it. The signals are partly chromatic, shifts in our skin register that carry specific, conventional meanings within the game, and partly gestural, involving the position of hands and the orientation of the token case. It is a game that rewards close attention to the other player's signaling behavior. We have played it on expeditions for as long as I have been running expeditions, and the team plays it well.
Doctor.
Solace watched the game from her end of the common area. I noticed this, particularly because she had positioned her chair to give herself a clear sight line to the game table, rather than to the window or to the secondary display she sometimes used for reference. She was watching the game with the quality of attention I had eventually learned to recognize as her working expression. The focused, unhurried, taking in everything expression of someone who is in the middle of observing something. Her notebook was open on her knee. I watched her for a moment from across the room and saw her write something, a quick, dense notation, the kind of writing that suggests you are recording something before it changes, rather than reflecting on what you already know. She was drawing a hand, not an entire person, a hand, and what it was doing with the token case. The notation beside it was small and close-packed. Something shifted at the edge of my understanding. I am, as I have said, a scientist. I notice things. The thing I noticed at that moment was that she was making a detailed technical record of something specific about the way one of my crew members was holding a game token during a card game, and this seemed, for the first time, like a category of data that was not botanical. Then the weather display updated. The hold had shortened. Surface conditions were improving ahead of schedule. I moved to the communications panel and began coordinating the early resumption of surface work, and the thing at the edge of my understanding retreated. And I did not pursue it. This was the closest I came to understanding before the report arrived. I did not take the opportunity. The surface work resumed, and I was absorbed back into it. The survey was progressing well. We were exceeding our targets. More species documented, richer atmospheric data, behavioral footage that was, thanks to the array placement adjustments, considerably stronger than I had expected at the expedition midpoint. I was satisfied. The expedition was doing what I had designed it to do, and I was occupied with making sure it continued to do it. Dr. Solace continued to do what she had been doing since day one. She observed, she wrote, she drew. She rotated through her observation positions. She attended the surface operations days and found her spots at the edges of things and watched whatever was happening from those spots. She came aboard for the weather holds and sat in the common area or the observation bay and watched whatever was happening there. She ate at the end of the table and watched mealtimes. She asked, over the course of the entire expedition, perhaps 30 questions. Not 30 per day, 30 total, and all of them were brief and specific, and she listened to the answers with a quality of attention that I had stopped noticing because I had become accustomed to it. On day 40 of the survey, my junior technician Arath Solns came to my station during the afternoon analysis session. Arath Soln had been with my team for 6 months, his first long expedition, a young researcher still finding his professional footing. He had, over the course of the survey, been steadily integrating into the crew's existing social dynamics in the way that new members do. Carefully, watchfully, adopting the informal protocols of the group by observation and imitation, making small adjustments as he learned which behaviors were welcome and which were not. He was, in this respect, doing what all new members of established working groups do. He was watching. It had apparently occurred to him that someone else was also watching. He told me he had been watching Dr. Salas. She moves when no one is watching, he said, which was an odd way to phrase it but was what he meant. What do you mean? I said. She repositions herself, he said, when attention is on something else, when a piece of equipment is being set up, or when there's a loud discussion, or when the team moves to a new section of the site. She shifts her position. By the time anyone looks back at her, she's in the new spot. It's very quiet. I considered this. She is managing her presence to minimize disturbance to what she's observing, I said. It is a field technique, continuous small adjustments to maintain optimal observation distance without triggering awareness. Arath Soln looked at me for a moment. Awareness in who? He said. I opened my mouth. Then I closed it. The plants don't care where she sits, Arath Soln said. The herd animals habituated to her completely 3 weeks ago. They'll walk past her. She's studying a range of species, I said. Arath Soln nodded, in the way of someone who has decided not to press a point. He returned to his station. I watched him go, and then I looked across the analysis room to where Dr. Salas was sitting. And she was writing in her notebook. And I thought, with a brief sharpness, that I immediately set aside, because I had work to do, that Arath Soln had asked exactly the right question. Awareness in who? I set it aside. We were on day 40 of a 53-day expedition and I had a survey to complete. On day 47, we completed our primary survey of the third planet and began the closing protocols for Hadrith 7 Null. The data was good, better than good. We had catalogued 43 previously unregistered species, confirmed, and in several cases revised the preliminary atmospheric models, collected VUIC material that would support years of laboratory analysis, and produced a behavioral data set for the megafauna of the northern temperate zone that I was confident represented the best first contact documentation of any comparable survey in the past decade. I was satisfied in the specific, weary, complete way that the end of a long field expedition produces when the work has gone well. Dr. Salas spent the final day of surface operations, in her rotation as usual, moving through her positions at the edges of things, watching, writing. The notebook she had been using for the last week was nearly full. I noticed this, because she had begun a new one, a gray one, rather than the dark blue she had been using throughout the expedition. The color change caught my eye, at some point during the afternoon, and I noted it, in the vague way that one notes a small visual change in a familiar background. And I thought nothing further of it. I know now that she was consolidating. The gray notebook was for the final review and cross-reference work, the stage in a field study, where you go back through your raw observations and confirm your taxonomy and reconcile the notation conventions you used at the start of the study with the ones that had evolved by the end of it. She was doing closing field work. So was I. We were both completing our reports. I did not know this, because I had not thought about the gray notebook for more than a few seconds. She submitted her field report on the second day of the transit home. I was in my survey office, reviewing the preliminary species count for inclusion in my expedition summary, when the notification arrived. It was from the Interspecies Research Registry, not from Dr. Salas. The registry had received a field report submission from 1M Salas, Meridian Institute for Field Biology, reference number IRS 7 Hadrith Sol 001, and was writing to inform the named expedition lead, myself, that the report had been accepted for preliminary review, and that a formal index number would be assigned within 48 hours. The registry routing protocol sends notifications to expedition leads when a field report, submitted by a crew member or assigned observer, names the expedition as the data source. The notification had been routed to me because Dr. Solis's report named Keth Saral Biological Expedition 7 Hadrith as the primary data source. I read the notification, then I read it again, then I sent her a message asking for the report document, in the neutral tone of a survey lead. Following a standard administrative protocol, which I was, and also in the tone of someone who was starting to feel something at the edge of their awareness, that they did not yet have a category. For, she replied within 4 minutes, 47 pages, including appendices. The title read, Behavioral Ecology and Social Communication Systems of the Keth Saral, a field study conducted aboard survey vessel Sornvath during Biological Expedition 7 Hadrith, DIS 147. I read the title, then I read it 2 more times, then I opened page 1. The first section was a general introduction to the study population. 9 field specialists, plus 1 expedition lead, comprising a professionally affiliated working group with an established social hierarchy and an expedition history of 6 to 14 years of prior collaboration, depending on the individual. She had our names, she had our roles, she had our years of prior collaboration, she had the structure of the group mapped with a clarity that I found, reading it, quietly startling. Not because she had the formal hierarchy wrong, she had the formal hierarchy exactly right. But because she also had the informal hierarchy, the actual social architecture of how the group functions in practice, which is a different thing from the organizational chart, and requires sustained, attentive observation to see clearly. She had the Soreth Von and Teth Varus dynamic. Not just that they disagreed frequently, but how their disagreements worked. The particular quality of engagement that distinguishes genuine scientific dispute from the performance of dispute, and which of their disagreements fell into which category, and what the resolution pattern looked like when Teth Varus was right versus when Soreth Von was right. And the fact that both of them knew the difference, even when the conversation suggested otherwise. She had Van Carr's function as the crew's informal social coordinator, the role he plays in managing the mood of a shared working environment, which is not formal, which is not assigned, which had simply developed over years of expeditions together, and which I had never formally noted, because it requires no formal noting. The work happens, the group functions well. The reason it functions well is partly Van Carr. And this had apparently been visible to a careful outside observer in a way that it had not been visible to me, possibly because I was inside it. She had Areth Soln. She described him as occupying a probationary social position, not yet fully integrated into the crew's established interaction patterns, exhibiting communication behaviors consistent with institutional newcomer status. Specifically, the behaviors of someone who is learning a group's informal protocols through observation and imitations, rather than through explicit instruction. He had been with my team for 6 months. The description was accurate in every detail. The second section was a taxonomy of communicative gesture. She had identified and catalogued 23 distinct nonverbal signals used by my crew in social and professional contexts. They were classified by function, by the contexts in which they appeared, by the behavioral sequences they accompanied, and by their relationship to each other. Which signals co-occurred, which excluded each other, which appeared in response to specific social conditions, and which were more generalized. 11 of the 23, she noted in a sidebar, appeared to be undescribed in existing conclave xenobiology literature. On the Keth Saral, she had named and described them herself. I will say something about those 11. The Keth Saral are not, as a species, unaware of our own communicative success. We study ourselves, as any scientifically oriented species eventually does. We have a literature on Catalogued social behavior. We have taxonomies of gesture, catalogs of chromatic register, peer-reviewed analyses of communication in professional and social contexts. What we do not have, or did not have until the registry accepted IRS 7 Hadreth Sol 001 KSB, was a description of those 11 signals. The reason is not obscure. In retrospect, the signals she had identified were all context-specific, small, and semi-automatic. The kind of behavioral patterns that emerge in a population of individuals who know each other well and have developed, over years of close collaboration, a communication layer that sits below the formal signal vocabulary and carries information that the formal vocabulary was not designed to carry. They are not taught. They are not conscious most of the time. They accrete. A team that has worked together for 6 years has them in ways that a team that has worked together for 6 months does not. And neither team could tell you exactly what they are, because they are not the kind of thing you notice from the inside. She had noticed them from the outside. She had the data from 12 people across 47 days, and she had the training to see what she was looking at, and she had written it down. The descriptions were accompanied by illustrations. I looked at the illustrations for a long time. She had drawn our gestures, specific postural configurations, the joint angles that carry meaning, the hand positions that function as signals in our nonverbal communication, with the same quality of observational precision I had seen in the hip megafauna drawings from the North Ridge. The lines were clean, the proportions were correct, the annotations were placed where they added information rather than where they were convenient. The illustration labeled agreement signal, professional context variant, observed in individual SV. SV being Soreth Van, depicted a very specific orientation of the secondary shoulder joint that Soreth Van uses when she has been argued into a position she can't technically refute but doesn't entirely endorse. It is a small signal. It is context-specific. It is not in any description of Catalogued social gesture that I am aware of, because it is the kind of thing that takes sustained observation of a specific individual over an extended period to isolate and identify. She had spent 47 days observing Soreth Van, among others, at close range in a naturalized environment. She had isolated it. I put the document down, metaphorically, since it was on a screen, and sat still in my survey office for a moment. Something that I had been not quite understanding for several weeks was settling into a shape I could now see clearly. And the shape was this. I had been conducting a biological survey of Hadreth 7 Null, and Dr. Marin Salas had been conducting a behavioral study of the Catalogued, and we had been doing these two things simultaneously in the same field environment for 47 days. And I had not known that the second thing was happening, because I had decided what she was doing before. I had finished looking at what she was actually doing. I went back to the report. The third section was a social hierarchy analysis, both formal and functional, with a careful distinction between the two and an analysis of the conditions under which they diverged. There was a section on intra-crew communication during collaborative task process that I recognized, with the uncomfortable clarity of reading an accurate account of something you were present for, as a description of what my team does during the evening data consolidation sessions. There was a section on mealtimes. There was a section on dispute resolution that covered the card game, the signals, the betting behavior, the interaction between the formal rules of the game, and the informal social dynamics of the players. She had the card game. She had the chromatic signals that operate within the game, and the gestural signals that accompany them, and the behavioral patterns that distinguish a player who is confident from a player who is performing confidence. She had not been able to read our chromatic signals directly. She said so clearly, in a methodological note, at the opening of the section. What she had done instead was map the physical and behavioral contexts in which chromatic shifts occurred, what preceded them, what followed them, what responses they produced in other crew members, and construct a functional description of what each category of shift was doing in the social interaction based on the observable behavioral evidence alone. The functional descriptions were, in the cases I could check against my own knowledge of what the shifts meant, largely correct. In 3 cases, she had noted that her data was insufficient to make a confident claim, and described what additional observation would be needed. To resolve this ambiguity, a scientist noting the limits of her data. The 4th section was an ethological analysis, the patterns of behavior that emerge in the study population under different conditions, fieldwork, data processing, enforced inactivity, social rest periods, the transitions between them. There was a subsection on the behavioral indicators of expedition phase transitions, which described the shift in crew behavior between arrival at a new field site and survey operations, with a precision that suggested she had observed this transition on multiple occasions with multiple species, and knew what she was looking for. She had her publication list, which she had included in the appendices as a standard methodological reference, showed 14 years of field studies. 8 of them, I noted, were studies of conclave member species in professional environments. Not incidentally, specifically, she had spent 14 years going to places where non-human species worked, and sitting at the edges of their working environments, and recording what she saw. Our expedition had been, from her perspective, a standard field assignment in her primary research area. She had brought the same notebooks she always brought, used the same techniques she always used, sat in the same quality of careful stillness she had learned to maintain over 15 years of practice. She had done this before. She was very good at it. The 5th section was the species comparison context, a placement of the Keth-Seral behavioral patterns she had documented within the broader framework of social behavioral ecology, comparing and contrasting with documented patterns in other conclave species. She was careful here about claims and non-claims. Where the data supported a comparative observation, she made it directly. Where it didn't, she said so. The appendices included her field notebook index, a chronological list of every observation session she had conducted, with the date, the duration, the location, and a 1-line content description. I read through it slowly. The index ran to 4 pages. Day 1. Initial population inventory. Professional role identification. Preliminary assessment of group social dynamics. That was the day she arrived. She had begun the study immediately. The entry for the transit's first week described a series of daily, preliminary behavioral inventory sessions that she had conducted in the observation bay, the common area, and 3 times in the corridor outside the secondary analysis room when the door was open and the team inside was working. The entry for our first night at Hadrath 7 Null, the pre-survey briefing session, read, Field Deployment Preparation Behaviors, Hierarchy Expression, Under Task Coordination Stress, Newcomer Integration Markers, Extended Observation. The entry for the card game day, the weather hold, day 28, read High Yield Session, Informal Social Behavior, Game Signaling Protocols, Collegial Dispute Dynamics, Chromatic Register under Competitive Conditions, Newcomer Observation of Established Group Practices. She had been watching Aerith Soln watch the card game, and had been recording what she saw. The final entry before the closing and consolidation phase read, End of survey day 47. Complete final rotation of observation positions. Confirm 11 undescribed signals against full dataset cross-reference. She had been confirming 11 undescribed signals on the last day of the survey. While I was reviewing species counts, we had both spent the final field day completing our reports. I had not known this. I had thought she was making final botanical sketches. I sat in my survey office for a long time after I finished reading. I thought about the 47 days in a way that I had not been capable of thinking about them while they were happening, because while they were happening, I had not understood what the 47 days were. I thought about the Observer dossier. 3 pages. The research focus clearly described on page 3, the words conclave member species, and communicative and social systems, and long-duration field observation. I had read those words. I had processed them through the filter of what I had already decided she was, and they had not corrected me, because I had not let them. I thought about the card game evening, and what Arathsoln had said, awareness in who, and the question I had not finished following. I thought about Sorith Vaughn saying, among other things, and the note I had made to follow up, and then had not. I thought about 35 days of her rotating through observation positions, and the moment I had correctly identified that the rotation was deliberate and systematic, and the conclusion I had drawn from that, which was that she was rotating to see more plant species, and which was wrong in its specifics and correct in nothing except the word deliberate. I thought about the gray notebook, the closing and consolidation notebook, and myself reviewing species counts at the same table on the same day, the two of us completing our reports in parallel, and how comprehensively I had missed it. I thought about the animals on the North Ridge, the juveniles investigating the rock. We had been slower than the juveniles. I sent her a message. It said, "I have read the report. It is very thorough," she replied. "Thank you. I had good access conditions." I read that reply several times. Good access conditions. We had treated her as benign furniture. Pleasant, unobtrusive furniture that one checked in with due to procedural requirements, and otherwise left at the edges of rooms. And she had characterized this accurately and without irony as good access conditions, because that is what it was. A field naturalist studying social behavior in a species that has entirely forgotten. She as an observer is working, from a methodological standpoint, in the best conditions available. We had given her those conditions. We had given her 47 days of them. We had done it without being asked, without being aware of it, and without any comprehension of what we were providing. We had forgotten she was an observer. I want to be precise about what this means, because I think it matters. We had not been careless about it. We had not been negligent. We had been systematic. We had read her documentation, processed her category, courtesy observer, behavioral naturalist, minimal operational footprint, and then, having categorized her, had given our attention to other things, the way you give your attention to other things, once you believe you have understood what something is. The error was not in failing to pay attention. The error was in believing I had already paid enough. She had not made this error. She had paid attention for 47 days. The registry sent its formal acknowledgement on the 4th day of the transit home. The report was assigned index number, IRS 7 Hadreth Soal 001 KSB. The suffix KSB indicated, per registry protocol, that the primary subject of the study was a conclave member species, in this case, the Kethseral, and that the registry had forwarded a summary notification to the Kethseral Compact's Scientific Liaison Office in accordance with the data sharing agreement between the Compact and the Conclave. My director, Overseer Veth Karin, at the Compact Liaison Office, messaged me before I had finished reading the registry's formal acknowledgement letter. Her message said, "Your survey report is excellent. There is a separate registry notification referencing your expedition and involving a document designated IRS 7 Hadreth Sol 001 KSB. Please explain." I explained. This conversation took approximately 40 minutes. At the end of it, Overseer Vethkarin was quiet for the duration of time that signals she is deciding how to say something. Then she said, "She studied you for 47 days and you thought she was studying the plants." "Fauna," I said. "The local fauna, primarily." Another silence. "She disclosed her research focus in the standard dossier," I said. "I read it before she boarded." "What did it say?" "Behavioral ecology and species ethology." Focus on long-duration field observation of communicative and social systems in non-sapient and conclave member species. The silence this time was of a different quality. I had prioritized the phrase non-sapient, I said, given our survey focus. I see, Vethkaran said, in the tone that means I see exactly what happened, and I am choosing not to say what I think about it. She asked whether the compact intended to contest the report's registry acceptance. I said no. The report was methodologically sound, accurately sourced, and produced by a researcher who had been transparently assigned to our expedition, and whose research focus had been clearly documented. I saw no grounds for contest and frankly no desire to attempt one. The report was accurate, contesting accurate science, because it documented something I had preferred not to have documented, seemed inadvisable, and also wrong. She's going to do this again, Vethkaran said. On another expedition, I had thought about this. The Observer Placement Office rotates researchers through conclave expeditions on an ongoing basis. Dr. Solis had a record of minimal operational footprint. She would be popular with expedition leads, for exactly the reasons that had made her valuable to us. She did not disrupt operations. She did not demand resources. She fit herself into the edges of the working environment, without requiring accommodation. She would be assigned. She would board the next vessel with her kit bag and her flat drawing case, and she would find her position at the edge of the operations area, and some other expedition lead would allocate her a perimeter spot and tell themselves that the naturalist was studying local biota and would require periodic welfare checks per protocol. I filed a note with the Observer Placement Office. I recommended that Dr. Solis's observer profile be updated to explicitly flag that she conducts concurrent behavioral studies of conclave member species present in her field environment, and that expedition leads be informed of this research scope before departure, so that they could discuss it with her and set any necessary parameters in advance. I cited the registry report number and described, in terms I tried to keep clinical, the study she had conducted during our expedition. The Observer Placement Office replied within 6 hours. They thanked me for the notification. They added that the information had been noted in Dr. Solis's profile. They also noted, at the end of the message, that Dr. Solis had disclosed her research interests and active study focus to the Placement Office at the time of her initial observer registration, which had occurred 5 years earlier, and that this information had been included in the standard 3-page observer dossier, distributed to expedition leads at the time of observer assignment. I went back and read the dossier again. Page 3, the research focus section, behavioral ecology and species ethology, with a focus on long-duration field observation of communicative and social systems in both non-sapient species and conclave member species in natural and constructed social contexts. In natural and constructed social contexts, a survey vessel is a constructed social context. I had read those words before she boarded the Sornvath. I had read them and processed them through the filter of a decision I had already made. Courtesy observer, procedural requirement, someone to check in with twice a day, and otherwise leave at the perimeter. The words had been there. The category I had put her in had been wrong. Both things had been true simultaneously, for 47 days, and the second thing had not corrected the first, because I had not been looking at what was actually in front of me. She had been looking at what was actually in front of her. She did this for a living. Dr. Solis disembarked at Transit Hub Ketharanu with her kit bag and her flat case and 4.5 notebooks worth of data. She sent me a brief message the morning after we docked, thanking me for the expedition access and the cooperative field environment. I replied that it had been a productive survey. Both statements were accurate from both perspectives, though we had been surveying different things. The report is indexed in the registry as IRS 7 Hadrith Soal 001, KSB. It has been downloaded, as of the date I am writing this statement, 63 times. primarily by Catalogued behavioral researchers, and by the Conclave Interspecies Studies Division. This I find appropriate. We are, it turns out, an understudied species from the perspective of external behavioral ecology. The report is, by any rigorous standard, a useful primary source. I reviewed it again last month with the particular attention of someone who now knows what they are reading, and I found it accurate in every substantive particular. There are 3 points where she noted insufficient data and recommended follow-up. The recommendations are well-founded. She is currently assigned, per the Observer Placement Office's public listing, to a geological survey expedition operated by the Dithrani Survey Collective. 61 days in the Sorn-Hadrith corridor. I sent a courtesy message to the Dithrani expedition lead, a colleague I have met twice at compact conferences. The message said, "Please read Dr. Solis's observer dossier carefully, and particularly the 3rd page." She sent back a short reply, "I always read the full dossier." I wrote, "So did I." She did not respond to that. It was the correct response, the still one. We called her the still one and thought it was a mild, affectionate nickname for an organisms that sat quietly in the corners of our working environment and caused no difficulty. We were correct that she sat quietly. We were correct that she caused no difficulty. We were correct, even, that she was still. She was exceptionally still, with a practiced, disciplined stillness that my junior technician had found faintly disconcerting from a species-level nervous system response, and that was, as I now understand it, a professional technique refined over 15 years of fieldwork. The fauna on the North Ridge habituated to her, completely, within 3 hours. They walked past her. They fed in the depression below her rock. The juveniles investigated the rock itself and lost interest. We took somewhat longer. I have added a line to my expedition preparation checklist. It sits between confirm atmospheric sampling array calibration and review surface safety protocols for field team. It reads, read the observer dossier to the bottom of page 3. I cannot say with certainty that this would have changed anything. The dossier was accurate, and I had read it, and I had still spent 47 days, not understanding what was in front of me, but it seemed like the right place to start. With the information that was already there, waiting, clearly described, in the document I had been given for exactly this purpose. We study things for a living, my team and I. We go to places that have not been studied, and we look at them carefully, and we record what we find. This is what we do. We are good at it. She is better at the looking.